General Naramsin surveyed the battlefield with apprehension and a creeping feeling of helplessness. He had been tasked with halting the advance of the roskill on the capital of the Keshi homeworld by order of the Galactic Coalition's Grand Council. He had been given command of a coalition grand army of 500,000 soldiers, which included a contingent from every member of the coalition, as had been their tradition for centuries. An army of this size had not been gathered in over 200 galactic years, and he expected to overwhelm the roskill into surrendering or fleeing. But they hadn't been that accommodating. The roskill had appeared on the border of coalition space about 2 galactic years ago, claiming friendship and trade. They said one of their probes had come across a Direct Toto exploration ship that had suffered a catastrophic decompression after something pierced its hull in several places, possibly an asteroid storm. None of the crew had survived, but the computer core was intact, allowing them to determine the ship's origin. They said they wanted to return the bodies of the crew, but the ship was too damaged and broke up while being towed to a station. This gesture led to the Toto and the Galactic Coalition welcoming them with open arms, or at least most of them did. The humans were more reserved in their dealings with the roskill, but the Council assumed it was because the humans had only recently joined the Coalition and didn't know any better. Many of the Grand Councillors brushed aside their concerns without even listening to them. Others thought the humans were jealous of the trade deals the newcomers were making, especially in markets the humans had yet to gain access to. Eventually, the humans gave up on their attempts to advise caution in dealing with the roskill. 6 months ago, the humans were proven right not to trust the roskill. A roskill armada crossed the border into Toto space, devastating their homeworld and several colony worlds. Few survived, and those that did reported outages in subspace communication and power grids. After determining the same thing had happened at the same time on the other colony worlds, it became clear they had been sabotaged by the roskill. All their claims of wanting peaceful trade were just an excuse to scout coalition defenses and future targets. For systems fell before the sluggish coalition military tried to fight back, but having been at peace for over a century, their navies were better suited to fighting pirates than full-size warships. Once again, the humans tried to warn the coalition, but they were not as technologically advanced as the rest of the coalition forces, so they were ignored. Even after a roskill fleet attacked a human colony world and was driven off by a smaller human fleet, it was called luck and a diversion. The coalition lost every engagement against the roskill in space and on the ground. After decades of peace, their military had become what humans dismissively called a parade ground army. Human officers would say they looked good during ceremonies, but their training was woefully inadequate and far too reliant on advanced technology. Once again, the coalition military high command ignored their advice. Humans still used projectile weapons. What could such primitive people know? Despite their offers of assistance, the humans were not asked to join in combat operations with the rest of the coalition military. They were told to stay and guard their worlds. The High Command believed they only needed more men, ignoring reports from the few survivors of battles that their tactics were inadequate to deal with the constantly shifting strategies of the roskill. No matter how perfectly they followed the plans devised by the High Command, the roskill always found a weak spot and exploited it. The invasion of the Keshi homeworld finally convinced the High Command to invite the humans to fight with them. Rumors spread that it was only because they needed the numbers. The humans were told to send only a contingent, not their entire military, to assist. The humans shrugged and sent a single division of 50,000 soldiers and support units, practically self-sufficient with their own heavy weapons, transports, medical units, and more. Thus, the largest fleet the Grand Coalition had assembled in centuries set out for Keshi. They dropped out of FTL to find a roskill fleet already in orbit. Troop transports began making planetfall while the warships engaged the roskill. The human warships were on the far right end of the battle line and drove into the roskill flank before they were fully deployed. The roskill knew what would happen if they stayed, so after the humans broke their far left and started to loop around behind the others, they disengaged and fled. The fleet admiral thought they had fled from his superior numbers, and the humans didn't bother correcting him. General Naramsin watched his army disembark with satisfaction. Decked out in their gleaming body armor, they marched off the ships in step, lined up in neat rows, and presented their pulse rifles just as if they were on a parade ground before the high command, except for the humans. Their body armor was a dull green, and several of them trotted off in different directions, while others helped unload their equipment, which included archaic weapons. Their guns fired small projectiles via chemical propulsion, and their vehicles had long tubes sticking out of the top they called self-propelled guns. They had a variety of other weapons, even knives. How primitive, General Naramsin thought, and left the humans to guard the landing ships. The human officer seemed annoyed but saluted and told his troops to dig in. The humans began digging holes around the ships, which puzzled the general. Were they planning to hide from the enemy? How cowardly! Once all his troops had disembarked, he formed them into a column and went out to find the enemy, minus the humans. His troops looked impressive in their shining body armor and perfectly ordered columns. He was sure the roskill would take one look at his vast numbers and flee. Confident, he didn't bother sending scouts on his flanks, his hand scanners would suffice. His sensors finally located the enemy army, which wasn't even a fourth the size of his own. He deployed his troops into a battle line and marched toward the enemy. His army finally caught sight of the roskill, who fired a few shots before turning and running away. General Naramsin laughed. He knew they would run. Certain of his quick victory, he ordered his army to give chase, sending the fastest race, the Norkan contingent, ahead to pin the enemy down. With the Norkan sprinting ahead, he ordered the rest of his troops into 4 columns and followed at double speed. Just as he was smiling at the thought of victory, everything changed. As they passed the spot where they had first seen the roskill, the fleeing enemy suddenly turned and opened fire on the Norkan. It was like they had run into a buzzsaw. Hundreds went down. Surprised, Naramsin's army stopped their pursuit. Then, the other shoe dropped. Roskill soldiers popped up from hiding spots and fired into both flanks of his army. Their energy weapons pierced the armor of his troops with ease. Barely had his soldiers begun to return fire when the ground erupted with hidden explosives set by the roskill. This was the last straw for the disoriented army, and it shattered into chaos, with every contingent looking out for itself. General Naramsin managed to keep his contingent of Shiran troops, along with 3 other races, together, leaving him with a quarter of the forces he had started with. The rest panicked and ran, and the roskill gleefully cut them down in great numbers. The general hoped his group could retreat in good order, but there were more roskill than he had imagined, and they were nearly surrounded. He tried to call for help, but all he received was static. The roskill were likely jamming the communications. Desperate, he ordered his troops to take cover in the blast holes created by the explosions. The only saving grace was that there were so many fleeing coalition soldiers that not all the enemy fire was directed at them. Still, his troops were slowly being whittled down by accurate roskill fire. The heavier roskill weapons made a terrifying thunderclap when fired, and the psychological impact was almost as dangerous as the energy bolts themselves. General Naramsin could see the panic rising on his soldiers' faces. He said a silent prayer to his ancestors, preparing himself for the end. He didn't even notice the new sounds on the battlefield at first, a series of pops, cracks, and other noises he couldn't identify. Moments later, there was a whistling noise followed by a huge boom, as massive fountains of dirt erupted from artillery fire. Peeking over the edge of his hole, Naramsin saw hundreds of humans firing into the startled roskill. He was amazed as he watched the humans advance in a coordinated manner. One group would run forward and drop to the ground, firing on the enemy, while another group ran past them and took cover before opening fire. They repeated this process, slowly but steadily advancing on the roskill. Their dull green armor made them harder to see, and only a few were hit by the enemy's return fire. General Naramsin was thrilled to hear the screams of the roskill as the humans attacked from several directions. The roskill, who had grown used to dominating their battles with the coalition, were caught completely off guard and had no idea how to respond. Faced with only 2 options, flee or die in place, those who hesitated were lost. As more humans arrived on the battlefield, it took less than a quarter of an hour to finish off the last of the roskill. Human medics then moved through the battlefield, tending to the wounded they could still save. A human officer approached Naramsin, saluted, and identified himself as Colonel Sellers of the Terran Marines. The general returned the salute with a huge sense of relief.